You never forget the sound of fear. For me, it was the creak of the front door on a windless night, the way it moaned as my father stepped in, reeking of bourbon and something worse. I was only a child, but I knew. When that door opened after dark, it meant silence wasn't safety, it was survival. Now, at 76, I finally dare to tell the story behind that silence. Because somewhere out there, maybe there's another little girl who still hides under her bed, praying for morning. My name is Harriet Romero. I live in Viroqua, Wisconsin, in a small white house tucked behind a bakery that smells like cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings. To my neighbors, I'm just the old lady who knits scarves for the shelter and brings apple cobbler to church picnics. No one ever asks about my past, and for a long time, I was grateful. But recently, as my bones ache a little more and my memories weigh a little heavier, I've come to believe that some stories are meant to be told, not for pity, but for power. You see, the truth is, I wasn't always Harriet, the quiet grandmother with warm mittens and a tidy garden. Once, I was the girl who never spoke unless spoken to, the girl who flinched when someone raised their hand too fast, the girl whose childhood played out like a whisper in the back of a house too small for hope. I was born in the fall of 1948 right here in Viroqua, when Main Street still had cobblestones, and you could buy a loaf of bread for 12 cents. My mother, Martha Romero, worked double shifts at the local diner and stitched clothes at home by lamplight. Her fingers were always sore, but her voice was too soft to stand up to the man she married. My father, Frank Romero, was a carpenter by day and a drunk by night. He had the kind of voice that filled a room, whether you wanted it to or not. Some men are born mean, others become it over time. Frank was a storm waiting for a reason, and I was often that reason. Our house wasn't poor in the way people usually think. There was always food, always running water, but it was starving in a different sense. Starving for warmth, for kindness, for safety. We had curtains but no light. We had walls but no shelter. I still remember the way the kitchen smelled in the mornings like burnt toast and stale coffee, and the way the air changed when my father's truck rolled into the driveway late at night. It was like the whole house held its breath. My mother would smooth her apron, her eyes darting to the door, while I froze like a deer in headlights. You never knew which version of him would walk in. Sometimes he'd grumble and collapse into his chair. Other times, the yelling would start before the door even closed. I learned to read the signs early, the heaviness in his steps, the slam of his fist on the table, the sharp snap of his belt being pulled too fast from his jeans. I was 5 when I realized my life wasn't like the other kids at school. Their fathers kissed their foreheads and helped with homework. Mine drank from a chipped flask and barked insults like commands. And my mother, God bless her, just kept surviving. One quiet breath at a time. She never smiled much. I don't think I ever saw her laugh. Her eyes always looked far away, like she was watching a different life play out on the other side of the window. She'd run her fingers through my hair sometimes, gently, like she wanted to say something, but had forgotten how. I never blamed her. Not really. She was as much a prisoner in that house as I was. The only difference was she'd chosen it. By the time I was 7, I could predict my father's moods with terrifying accuracy. I knew which nights to hide and which nights to pretend to sleep so deeply he'd leave me alone. I became a master of silence. If I didn't speak, if I didn't move, I couldn't be hurt, or so I believed. Looking back now, it's no wonder I became the kind of girl who sat alone during recess, who never raised her hand in class even when she knew the answer, who walked home the long way just to delay returning to that house. That house was never a home. It was a place where dreams curled up and died in the corners. And I was just trying to stay small enough not to be noticed. But something inside me refused to die. Even then, a flicker, a whisper, a quiet, stubborn voice that said, "One day, you'll leave this behind." At the time, I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I believed it. And now, all these decades later, I'm ready to tell how that voice, my voice, saved me. You wouldn't know it by looking at old photos of me, the ones with the stiff school dresses and tight braids. But I was never really a child, not in the way that children are meant to be. There were no pillow forts in the living room, no bedtime stories under the covers, no laughter echoing off the walls. I didn't grow up playing house. I grew up surviving inside one. From the moment I was old enough to understand the world around me, I knew mine was unsafe. My earliest memories are bathed in quiet fear. The constant hum of tension that filled the rooms of our tiny house on the edge of Viroqua was something I wore like a second skin. The linoleum floor in the kitchen was always cold, and so were the eyes of my father, Frank Romero. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw set so tight it looked like his teeth were glued together. But it wasn't his size that scared me. It was his unpredictability. Frank was a ticking clock that never told time right. One moment, he'd be working on a broken chair at the dining table. The next, he'd be slamming that same chair against the wall because a nail bent the wrong way. If he came home sober, the house held its breath. If he came home drunk, the house trembled. My mother, Martha, was like a ghost in her own life. She moved through our days with a kind of quiet grace, folding laundry, scrubbing floors, cooking meals that no one ever thanked her for. She bore everything in silence, his yelling, his criticisms, the way he'd toss his coat on the floor and demand she pick it up without a word. She never fought back. She never even raised her voice. As a little girl, I used to watch her in the kitchen window, her reflection layered with raindrops, and I'd wonder, is this all there is? But I didn't dare ask. In our house, questions were dangerous. Words were dangerous. I learned quickly that making myself small was the only way to be safe. I stopped asking for seconds at dinner. I stopped humming to myself when I played with my one doll. I stopped knocking on my parents' bedroom door when I had nightmares. No matter what I needed, silence became my shelter. And in that silence, I developed a strange sense of control. If I didn't cry, he wouldn't know I was scared. If I didn't speak, he couldn't use my words against me. That's the thing about growing up in fear. You start to believe that hiding is strength, but hiding isn't living. One winter night, I must have been 6. My father came home later than usual. The snow outside had piled high along the walkway, but inside the house, it was a furnace of tension. He slammed the door so hard that the clock above the stove fell and cracked. My mother rushed over to pick it up, but he pushed her aside. "Why is dinner cold?" he barked. It's just been waiting a little while." She whispered, "Wrong answer." His hand flew out and caught the edge of the plate, sending stew and ceramic crashing to the floor. Then he turned to me, his face red and eyes narrowed. I hadn't said a word. I hadn't even moved. But somehow, I was still a target. "Don't just stand there staring. Go to your room." I remember running so fast my feet barely touched the ground, and curling up in my bed so tightly I thought I might disappear completely. I stared at the wallpaper until my eyes hurt, until the silence outside my door told me he'd gone to bed. I didn't cry. I never cried in front of him. That night, like so many others. My mother came to my room long after the shouting had stopped. She sat on the edge of the bed, her silhouette a soft blur in the moonlight coming through the window. I waited for her to say something, maybe a whisper of comfort, a quiet apology, anything, but she never did. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. Then, without a word, she stood up and left. It broke my heart more than if she'd never come at all. At school, I kept my head down. Other kids brought peanut butter sandwiches in lunchboxes decorated with cartoons. I brought dry toast and wax paper. They played hopscotch and traded candy. I sat on the bench near the chain link fence, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, always watching, never joining. I didn't trust laughter. It felt too far away from the life I knew. The teachers didn't ask questions. I was quiet, polite, always did my work. But one of them noticed Miss Clara Walker, my English teacher. She watched me like she was trying to solve a puzzle no one else bothered to look at. She'd smile at me in the hallway, a kind smile that didn't try to fix anything, just saw me. I didn't know it then, but that smile would become a lifeline, because when you live in fear, the smallest kindness can shine like a lighthouse in a storm. Still, at home, nothing changed. The nights got colder, the silences got heavier, and my mother's eyes began to look more like shadows than windows. My father drank more, yelled louder, and I learned to shrink even smaller. I became so good at being invisible that sometimes I feared I might actually disappear. But even as I faded into the corners of that house, there was a part of me, quiet but stubborn, that refused to go out completely. It flickered like a candle in a drafty room, small and vulnerable but alive, and that flicker, as faint as it was, kept whispering the same thing every night one day. Harriet, one day you'll get out. It began with a whisper, not the kind of whisper that made me tremble like my father's threats in the dark, but a gentler one, a whisper from deep inside me, asking a question I'd never had the courage to answer. What if you told your story, not with your voice, but with your pen? I was 9 years old when Miss Walker gave me my first true invitation into the world of writing. We had just finished a spelling quiz, and while the rest of the class groaned and fidgeted, I kept my eyes on the blackboard, still too afraid to meet anyone's gaze. When the bell rang, I collected my things like I always did, quietly, quickly, hoping to vanish before anyone noticed me. But Miss Walker's voice called out gently, "Harriet, could you stay for a moment?" My heart dropped. Had I done something wrong? Was my quiz too perfect again? At home, being too good was suspicious. I turned slowly, gripping the edge of my desk. She smiled not with pity, but with curiosity. "Do you like stories?" I nodded hesitantly. "Do you ever write them?" "No," I whispered, though it wasn't quite true. I did write secretly. I filled the pages of old notebooks with things I could never say aloud. Girls who climbed mountains, boys who tamed wolves, mothers who ran away with their daughters and never looked back, fantasy worlds where pain had rules, and children always had someone who came for them in the end. Miss Walker tilted her head. "I think you have a story inside you, Harriet. I'd like to read it if you're willing." That night, after I finished the dinner dishes and waited for my father to drift off in his whiskey haze, I sat on the cold wooden floor of my bedroom with my stub of a pencil and one-lined notebook. I didn't know what to write, so I wrote what I wished. I wrote about a girl trapped in a tall stone tower. The girl had no name and no visitors. Her window faced the forest, and each night she listened to the wind and dreamed that one day it would carry her away. But unlike me, this girl had a secret she could fly, not with wings, not with magic, but with words. When I finished, the paper was smudged with graphite and a few tear stains I didn't realize I'd let fall. I slid the notebook under my mattress like I always did, like I was hiding treasure. The next morning, I stood at Miss Walker's desk and handed her a single page torn from the back of that notebook. I kept my head down the whole time. She didn't read it right away. She folded it, placed it in a folder, and said, "Thank you, Harriet. I'll take good care of this." Those words, "I'll take good care of this." I hadn't heard anything that tender in years. The next day after school, she stopped me again. "I read your story." My breath caught in my chest. She crouched down to meet my eyes. "You have a voice, Harriet, a powerful one. Don't ever let anyone take that away from you." I didn't know how to respond. I nodded, but inside I was shaking. I didn't feel powerful. I felt broken, small, and constantly on the edge of disappearing. But something about her words made me want to believe that maybe, just maybe, writing could be more than a secret. It could be a way out. From then on, writing became my lifeline. Every night, after the house went still, I'd open my notebook and pour my fears and dreams onto the page. I wrote about dragons and deserts, orphans and queens, spaceships and secret gardens. But hidden in every tale was a girl who longed for freedom, for safety, for someone to believe she mattered. Sometimes I imagined Miss Walker reading them, nodding quietly, whispering, "You're not invisible, not to me." It was the only time I felt seen, but I never dared to share another story, not with anyone, because stories were sacred and in my house. Nothing sacred ever stayed safe. I hid those notebooks under my mattress like they were my soul, folded tight in cheap binding. No one knew, not my mother, not my classmates, and especially not my father. Writing was mine. It was the one thing he hadn't touched, until one night he did. I had left my notebook out by accident, just one page, just one moment of forgetfulness. I was helping my mother dry the dishes when I heard the front door slam. My stomach turned. The stench of liquor filled the air before he even stepped into the kitchen. "What are you whispering about with that girl?" he slurred at my mother. "Just finishing the dishes," she replied, her voice thin. He turned to me, eyes narrowed. "And you, what are you always scribbling in those little books?" "Huh." My heart stopped. I hadn't told anyone. How did he know I looked toward the table my notebook lay open? "No," I whispered, barely audible. He grabbed it before I could move, flipping through the pages with rough hands. "Nonsense. Garbage. You think this makes you smart. Think this'll get you out of here." I stood frozen. My breath caught between fear and rage. Then he began to tear the pages, one by one. My voice, my worlds ripped apart before my eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, to beg, but I did none of that. I just stood there as pieces of myself fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. My mother tried to stop him. "Please, Frank, don't do that." He turned to her, fist clenched. "Stay out of it." She didn't argue, just turned away and picked up a dish towel like nothing had happened. That was the night I realized I wasn't just alone. I was disposable, and yet, somewhere inside the ruins of that moment, something held on, something fierce. Because if he could destroy those pages so easily, I'd just write more. I'd write until the words were strong enough to carry me away. That night, the one where my father tore through the pages of my soul, didn't end when the last scrap fluttered to the ground. Something deeper shattered. It wasn't just my stories that were destroyed. It was my trust in the last fragile hope I held that maybe, just maybe, I could keep one part of myself safe. But nothing in that house was safe. Not my voice, not my dreams, not even my silence. The days that followed blurred together like gray watercolor. My notebook was gone. The stories I had poured my heart into gone. And my mother, bless her quiet, weary soul, never mentioned it again. She returned to her routine, folding laundry and wiping counters as if her daughter hadn't just watched a lifeline get shredded by the hands of the man who was supposed to protect her. But she had seen it. I saw the flicker in her eyes when he ripped those pages. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't just fear. It was something dangerous. My mother had always been silent. It was her armor. But that night, something cracked in her too. And for the first time, I saw it. She wasn't just enduring my father, she was beginning to loathe him. Still, she didn't speak, and neither did I. I went to school with a tight jaw and swollen eyes. I didn't cry. I didn't know how anymore, but I couldn't bring myself to meet Miss Walker's gaze. I was ashamed. I had let my stories be found. I had let myself hope, and I had paid the price. At night, I would sit up in bed long after the house was dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the blank wall beside me. I didn't write. I didn't dream. I just breathed and counted heartbeats, 1, 2, 3, until I fell into uneasy sleep. Then, one Saturday afternoon, something changed. It was unusually warm for early spring in Viroqua. The snow had finally melted into slush, and the air smelled like thawed soil and chimney smoke. My mother was scrubbing the floor, and I was drying silverware at the sink when we heard the front door slam open. The tension returned instantly. He was early, too early. I could smell the booze before I heard his voice. It was harsh, slurred, dangerous. What are you two whispering about? He barked as he stumbled into the kitchen. Nothing. Frank, my mother said, rising slowly, trying not to meet his gaze. Just finishing chores. He looked at me. You're not writing more of your garbage, are you? No, I answered, eyes fixed on the floor. He snorted. Good. Waste of time. Ain't no one want to hear your whining. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He reached across the table and grabbed my arm. It wasn't hard. Not yet. But the grip was meant to remind me that I was his to control. You want to end up like your mother. Huh? Working until your hands bleed and still not worth a damn. I didn't answer. His grip tightened, and that's when my mother stepped between us. I couldn't believe it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. She simply placed herself between his rage and my fear, her body shaking, her eyes fixed on his. Let go of her. Frank, she said. He blinked, surprised, not by her words, but by the fact that she'd said them at all. What did you say to me? You heard me. For a moment, the room stood still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the uneven breathing of 3 people who had spent their lives pretending everything was fine. Then he laughed, a cold, mean laugh. He let go of my arm, shoved my mother aside, and stormed into the living room. She didn't look at me, just picked up the dish towel again. Her hands were shaking. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I heard him snoring from the other room, the deep, ugly sound of a man who drank himself past conscience. Then I heard soft footsteps approach my door. It opened slowly, My mother stood there in the glow of the hallway light, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot. She stepped inside and sat at the edge of my bed. "Harriet," she said softly, if something ever happens, I want you to remember something." I sat up. "You are not him, and you are not me. You are something else entirely, something strong." My lip trembled. It had been years since she had said anything like that. Anything real. "Okay," I whispered. She nodded and rose from the bed. Before she left, she did something that startled me. She leaned down and kissed my forehead. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, everything was normal again, or so it seemed, until I came home from school 3 days later and found the front door open. It was never open, ever. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. There, in the kitchen, sat my mother. She had a small suitcase on her lap. Her coat was buttoned. Her eyes didn't lift when I entered. They stared at the floor, unblinking. "Mama," I said. She looked up. Her lips trembled. "I can't anymore," she whispered. The words hit me like cold water. "Take me with you," I pleaded. She shook her head, tears falling. "I can't. I don't have anywhere to take you. But you said I thought I could. But I can't." I knew it was over the moment I saw her eyes. They were hollow in a way I'd never seen. She wasn't running toward anything. She was just escaping. "I'll come back for you," she said, barely getting the words out. But I knew she wouldn't, and she didn't. That afternoon, she walked out the door. And I watched from the window, unable to cry, unable to scream, as the one person who had shielded me, however quietly, disappeared down the road. The moment the door shut behind her, I stopped breathing. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean I literally froze in place. My lungs locked tight, as if holding still would rewind time and pull her back into the house. But nothing happened. No footsteps returned. No hand reached for the knob. No voice called my name. Just the ticking of the kitchen clock. Just me, alone. I don't remember how long I stood by the window, staring at the empty road. Long enough for the sun to dip behind the trees. Long enough for the ache in my chest to turn numb. When night fell and the porch light flickered on by its timer, it was no longer a beacon, it was a cruel reminder. My mother was gone. The house felt different without her, not just quieter, but hollow. There was no sound of a teapot whistling, no hum of her low voice as she folded towels, no scent of dinner simmering on the stove. The absence was unbearable and yet somehow familiar. I had always feared losing her, but I had never imagined it would happen like this, not silently, not without goodbye, and not without me. The next morning, I woke to an eerie silence that was nothing like the hush I had grown used to. This one wasn't filled with dread. It was just empty. For one foolish moment, I let hope creep in. Maybe she came back during the night, I thought. Maybe she realized she couldn't leave me behind. I rushed into her bedroom. The bed was untouched. The closet hung open. Half her clothes were gone. No, she hadn't come back. She wasn't going to. I wandered into the kitchen. No coffee brewing. No clean dish towels. No warmth. Then I remembered he was still here. A door creaked behind me, and I froze. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. My body tensed like a stretched rubber band, bracing for the snap. He entered the kitchen, hair disheveled, eyes swollen from drink. "Where's your mother?" he muttered. I didn't speak. "I asked you a question, girl." She left. His eyes darkened. "What do you mean?" "She left." I stared at the floor. "She took her suitcase." She's not coming back. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. He slammed his hand on the kitchen table, making the salt shaker jump. That ungrateful woman, he roared. She left me. She left us. I wanted to scream. She didn't leave us. She left you. But I didn't say it because I knew what would come next, and it did. The first slap knocked the breath out of me. It wasn't like his angry shoves or yells. It was deliberate, measured, a declaration. Without my mother, I had no shield. I fell to the floor, tasting blood on my lip. Don't cry, I whispered to myself. Don't cry, Harriet. He stormed out of the room without looking back, slamming the front door behind him. I lay there, blinking through tears I refused to let fall, trying to believe that this was still my life, that I had survived this long and could keep surviving. But something had shifted. Before, there had always been some part of me that thought, at least I have her. At least I'm not completely alone. Now I was completely. The days after that blurred together. He came home later and drunker, the house filled with the stench of beer and resentment. Anything could set him off: a dusty countertop, an unevenly folded towel, a door left ajar. He didn't need reasons anymore. I was just there, something to take his anger out on. I moved like a ghost, cleaned quietly, ate little, hid in corners. I stopped going to the backyard, stopped looking at the trees, stopped looking at the door, but I never stopped listening. Every creak, every cough, every clink of glass became a warning bell. And when the sun set, I counted the hours until dawn. One night, I tried to write again, just a single line, just one sentence about the girl in the tower who once dreamed of flying. But my hand shook so badly, the pencil slipped and left a smear across the page. I closed the notebook, not out of fear, out of grief. That girl was gone. Recess at school became the only time I breathed. I sat beneath the oak tree behind the cafeteria, tracing patterns into the dirt and watching the clouds drift overhead, wondering if my mother ever thought of me, wondering if she missed me, or if the silence she'd stepped into had become a comfort. Sometimes I hated her for leaving me. Sometimes I understood her completely, because I wanted to leave too. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd spent the evening scrubbing the floor with a rag until my fingers bled. My father had passed out on the couch with a bottle still in his hand. I tiptoed to the bathroom to wash up, my feet aching from crouching too long. But just as I turned off the light, I heard the sound of him stirring, the clink of the bottle falling to the floor, the slow creak of the floorboards under his weight. My blood turned cold. Then, his voice, low and slurred. "You think you can sneak around in my house?" I froze. "I know what you're doing," he said, voice rising, acting like your mother, whispering, judging. I didn't answer. Then came the heavy footsteps. He found me in the hallway. His eyes were bloodshot, his mouth curled into a sneer. "You're just like her," he hissed, coward. And then he grabbed me, harder than ever before. That was when I knew. He wasn't going to stop, not this time. And if I didn't get out soon, I wouldn't live long enough to see what life outside that house even looked like. There's a moment just before you break when the world stands still. It was sometime past midnight when I found myself pressed against the living room wall, my father's hand wrapped around my wrist, his breath thick with whiskey and rage. His grip wasn't just meant to restrain, it was a warning, a promise that whatever came next would be worse than what came before. "You think you can look at me like that?" he growled, though I hadn't even lifted my eyes. The fear in my chest had transformed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was deep, dull, and consuming. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't even flinch, because in that moment, something inside me had already gone quiet. He yanked my arm hard, throwing me backward against the wall. My head struck the plaster with a hollow thud, and for a second, the room spun. I tasted blood. My knees gave out, but even in the blur of pain, I saw his eyes, and what I saw terrified me more than any bruise or wound. There was no recognition, no restraint, just pure, seething hatred. He was going to kill me. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. The part of me that had waited for my mother to return, for someone to save me, for anything to change, snapped like a bone under pressure. I don't remember making the decision to run. I just remember moving. I crawled, then stumbled to my feet, my head pounding and vision spotted with black, and bolted for the front door. He shouted something behind me, words I couldn't make out, but I didn't turn back. My hand fumbled with the lock. It stuck. I yanked harder. The door groaned open, and I slipped into the night like a breath-escaping clenched teeth, barefoot in my nightgown. I ran down the dirt road behind our house. The gravel sliced my feet. The wind stung my face, but I didn't feel it. I didn't feel anything. I ran until the sounds of his shouts disappeared behind me. Ran until the air turned cold and my lungs burned. Ran until I could barely see through the tears clouding my vision. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't go back. Each step away from that house felt like a rebellion, like proof that I was still alive, that I was more than what he said I was. I reached the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the fields stretched open. I collapsed beside a rusted fence post and let the darkness wrap around me. And I cried, not quiet, stifled tears like I was used to. No, these were raw, guttural sobs, the kind that tear through you and leave you hollow. I cried for the girl I used to be. I cried for the stories he tore apart. I cried for the mother who left, and I cried for the child I would never be again. When the tears dried, the fear came rushing in. What now? Harriet, where will you go? Who will believe you? I had no answers, only a name, Miss Walker, my English teacher, the only adult who had ever seen me, really seen me. If anyone would believe me, it would be her. So I got up. My feet throbbed with every step, blood soaking into the dirt. My nightgown clung to my legs, heavy with dew and sweat. I wrapped my arms around myself and walked, one slow step at a time, toward the only place that had ever felt remotely safe, the school. The sky began to lighten behind the hills by the time I reached the old brick building. The front gates were still locked, but I crawled under the fence near the gym, scratching my knees on the gravel. I waited on the steps, shivering. When the first teachers began to arrive, I ducked behind the stone pillar, ashamed of how I looked bloodied, bruised, wild-eyed. But when I saw her, Miss Clara Walker, I couldn't hold back. Miss Walker, I called out, my voice hoarse. She turned, and I'll never forget the way her face changed. First surprise, then concern, and then something else, something fierce. Harriet, she said, rushing over. What on earth? I collapsed into her arms. She didn't ask questions. She didn't tell me to calm down. She simply wrapped her arms around me and held on. It's okay, she whispered. You're safe now. I've got you. For the first time in my life, someone said those words and meant them. She took me inside, into an empty office, sat me down, wrapped me in a blanket. She looked at my feet, my face, the torn sleeve of my gown, and she didn't flinch. Can you tell me what happened? She asked gently. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. I tried again. Still nothing. Too many years of silence. Too many warnings. Too many bruises carved into my throat like invisible hands. She didn't push. Instead, she stood up and said, "Wait here, sweetheart. I'm going to get help." When she returned, she wasn't alone. A woman named Mrs. Elaine Thompson walked in behind her, neatly dressed, kind-eyed, with a calm voice and slow steps. She worked for something called Child Protective Services. I didn't know what that meant. Not then. All I knew was she looked at me like I mattered. She sat beside me and said, "You don't ever have to go back to that house again." At first, I didn't believe her. I didn't believe anything could pull me out of that place. But when she took my hand and I felt the warmth of her fingers, something broke loose inside me. I started to speak in broken, shaking words. I told them everything. The shouting, the beatings, the night he tore my stories, the night I ran. They didn't interrupt. They didn't judge. They just listened. And when I was done, Miss Walker leaned in, brushed a tear from my cheek, and said, "You did the bravest thing a child could do. Harriet, you saved yourself." That was the moment I realized maybe I hadn't escaped too late. Maybe I had escaped just in time. After I told my story, the room fell into a stillness I'd never experienced before. It wasn't the tense silence of my house, the kind that made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. No, this silence was different. It was filled with something I couldn't name at the time, but now I know it was possibility. Mrs. Thompson squeezed my hand gently, then stood to make a call. Her voice was low and firm, and I only caught bits of it: immediate placement, not returning home, evidence of physical harm, words that seemed like they belonged to someone else's life. Miss Walker stayed with me the whole time. She brought me a glass of water and helped clean the dried blood from my hairline. When her fingers brushed a bruise on my shoulder, she paused. "You are so brave," she whispered. I didn't feel brave. I felt hollow, like I had poured everything out and now had nothing left inside. They gave me a change of clothes from the nurse's office, a plain sweatshirt and loose jeans, and I remember how strange it felt, wearing something that didn't smell like smoke or fear. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Thompson returned with a small overnight bag and a promise. "You won't be going back there," she said. "We have a place for you tonight, a safe place." I didn't ask where. I didn't care. Anywhere that wasn't that house was enough. As we drove through the back roads of Viroqua, I stared out the window, watching the farmland roll by in waves of spring green and fading snow patches. My body ached. My feet were still raw. But something inside me had shifted. The weight was still there, but now it was shared. We pulled into a small white house with a sloped roof and a porch swing that creaked gently in the breeze. A woman stood on the steps, her hands folded in front of her, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. "Harriet," Mrs. Thompson said, "this is Sarah Jennings. She'll be taking care of you for now." Sarah gave me a nod, no pity in her eyes, no overdone smile, just a quiet, steady presence. "Come in when you're ready," she said softly. I didn't move right away. I stood there, staring at the porch, trying to convince my legs that it was safe to climb those steps, that I wouldn't be met with a shout or a slap or an accusation. Sarah didn't rush me. When I finally walked inside, the warmth hit me first, not just from the heater, but from the scent of baked apples and cinnamon, like the kind my mother used to make when she could still remember joy. The living room was small, cozy, a quilt draped over the back of the couch, a stack of worn books near the fireplace, a dog-eared Bible on the side table. There were no yelling voices, no broken dishes, no cracked floor tiles beneath my bare feet. That night, Sarah showed me to a small bedroom at the end of the hallway. The bed had a handmade quilt, pale blue with tiny white stars. There was a small wooden desk in the corner and a lamp with a flowered shade. She handed me a pair of clean pajamas and said, "If you need anything, I'll be down the hall." I wanted to say thank you. I really did. But the words got stuck somewhere between my ribs and my throat. Instead, I nodded. That night, as I lay under the blanket, my body curled into itself. I waited for shouting, for slamming doors, for someone to burst in and demand something. But all I heard was the wind in the trees outside and the soft ticking of a clock on the dresser. I didn't sleep well, not yet. My body was still braced for the worst, but for the first time in my life, I drifted into sleep without fear of being hurt before morning. That was something. The next day, Miss Walker visited me. She brought a small box wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much," she said, placing it in my lap. Inside was a new notebook. The cover was navy blue. The pages inside were blank, crisp, untouched. "I thought you might like to start again." My fingers trembled as I ran them over the cover. "I don't know if I can," I whispered. "You will," she said gently, "when you're ready." I clutched the notebook to my chest. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the pain. But it gave me something I hadn't held in a long time, a beginning. It took time for me to understand that I wasn't just passing through Sarah Jennings's house, that this quiet, tidy place with its ticking clocks and soft rugs was not just a pause in the storm, but something far more terrifying, a beginning. At first, I moved like a shadow. I stepped softly, kept my eyes low, spoke only when asked. I watched Sarah's every movement, waiting for the change. I had learned to spot it in others, that shift in tone, that tightening of the jaw, the sudden bark that always came before pain. But with Sarah, it never came. She was steady, consistent, quiet, but not cold. She didn't try to force my trust. She didn't pepper me with questions or pretend everything would be okay. She simply made space for me, space to eat when I was hungry, space to sit in silence, space to breathe. Every morning, she'd set out breakfast, oatmeal with raisins, toast, a boiled egg, never too much, just enough. And when I ate too fast, like I expected someone to snatch the plate away, she'd say gently, "You don't have to rush. Harriet, the food isn't going anywhere." But my body didn't believe her yet. Neither did my heart. At night, I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, the blue quilt pulled up to my chin, and I'd wait for the sounds that had once defined nighttime for me, the jangle of a belt, the pop of a bottle, the heavy tread of my father's boots. But the only sounds here were the creak of the house settling and the occasional hoot of an owl outside the window. And the silence, it wasn't laced with dread. It was peaceful, strange. How peace can feel like fear when you've never known it before. I didn't return to school right away. Sarah said I could rest as long as I needed, but she didn't let me retreat completely. Each day, she'd invite me to do small things, help her peel potatoes, fold the laundry, sit on the porch with a book. She never pushed. One evening, I came into the kitchen to get a glass of water. Sarah was at the table, reading. She looked up, then reached for a pie plate on the counter. "I made apple pie," she said. "Would you like a slice?" I nodded slowly. She cut a piece and placed it on a plate, then added a scoop of vanilla ice cream on the side. As she slid it toward me, I stared at it for a long time. "What's wrong?" she asked. I shook my head. "Nothing. It's just, no one's ever made pie for me. Not because they wanted to." She smiled, a little sadly. "I make pie when someone needs comfort, and I think you've gone far too long without any." That night, I cried into my pillow not from fear or sadness, but from the strange, overwhelming ache of being cared for. And Sarah, she didn't just feed me or house me. She saw me. She learned how I flinched at loud noises, how I didn't like closed doors, how I slept with the light on, even if I claimed not to be scared. She never commented. She just left the hall light burning. Weeks passed, and slowly, I began to breathe deeper. I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. One day, I asked her why she had taken me in. She looked at me, her eyes kind but firm. "Because I've seen too many girls, like you, fall through the cracks. And I made a promise to myself a long time ago, if I could be a home for just one of them, I would." "You don't have kids of your own?" I asked. "No, but I've had many children of the heart." She pulled out a photo album. Faces smiled up at me, some older, some young. All of them had once passed through this house, carried stories of pain like mine, and left traces behind in the form of photographs and memories. "Where are they now?" I asked. "Some come back, some don't, but they all take a piece of me with them." I traced my finger over a photo of a girl about my age, her hair pulled back in a braid, her smile lopsided. "Do you think I'll stay?" I asked. Sarah didn't rush her answer. "That's up to you." But I hope so. It was the first time anyone had ever said they wanted me not out of duty, not out of guilt, but because they saw me and chose me. And slowly, I began to let myself believe in the possibility that I didn't just escape that house I had run towards something better. It was spring when the news came. I was sitting on the porch, a blanket across my lap and Sarah's dog, Gus, snoring gently at my feet, when she stepped outside with a letter in her hand. Her face was unreadable calm, but focused. She sat beside me, handed over the envelope, and said softly, "It's from Mrs. Thompson, about your father." I stared at it for a moment, unable to move. "Do you want me to read it to you?" she asked. I nodded. She unfolded the letter, her voice quiet but steady. "He's been arrested," she said, "caught in a bar fight. Police found old complaints. He's being held. He won't be able to contact you." The words didn't hit me all at once. Arrested, held, can't contact. It felt like a wall that had stood over me for years suddenly crumbled. I should have felt joy, relief, something triumphant. But what I felt first was fear. "Does he know where I am?" I asked quickly. Sarah shook her head. "No, honey, and he never will. You're safe." She reached for my hand. Her fingers were warm and steady. "You're safe," she repeated. I let the words settle. Safe. It was the first time in my life that word had felt real. And yet, as the days passed, a different question began to rise inside me. One I'd buried for months beneath fear and grief. It came quietly at first, like a whisper from the past. Where was she? My mother. Was she safe? Had she ever looked back? Did she even know what had happened to me? For weeks, I wrestled with the thought. I told myself it didn't matter, that she made her choice, that she left me, But the truth is, I needed to know. Not for her, for me. One evening, as Sarah cleared the dishes from dinner, I found the courage to speak. Sarah, I want to try and find my mother. She turned to me, surprised, but not disapproving. Are you sure? I nodded. I can't move on without knowing. Not really. She didn't question it. She just said, then we'll look, and we did. With the help of Mrs. Thompson, old records, and quiet phone calls, the search began. Weeks passed, then a month, until one day. Sarah's phone rang while we were baking muffins. She listened, her expression softening. She looked at me with careful eyes. They found her. She's living in a small town, not too far from here. My heart stopped. Is she okay? She's alive. That's all we know for now. The room fell quiet. Alive. That word, too, felt heavier than it should. Did she think about me? Had she wondered where I ended up? Did she believe she'd saved herself? Or failed me? I didn't have answers, but I was ready to face the questions. Looking back now, I see that moment for what it was, the start of my true healing. It wasn't just escaping him. It wasn't just finding safety. It was facing the past without fear. And I knew, whatever came next, whether she welcomed me or turned away again, I would still be okay. Because I wasn't that little girl hiding in corners anymore. I was Harriet. I had survived. And now, I was ready to reclaim my story, no longer in secret, but out loud. I still remember the moment I saw her again. It was a warm afternoon in early summer, years after I had escaped that house, years after I had learned how to breathe on my own again. Sarah and I had driven to a quiet retirement community outside Prairie du Chien, where the staff told us Martha Romero, my mother, had been living under a different last name. She was sitting in a wooden rocking chair on a shaded porch, her silver hair tied back with a cloth ribbon, her eyes fixed on the garden beyond the fence. When I stepped into view, something shifted in her gaze, recognition, and then remorse. She stood slowly, hesitant, as if her legs might give out under the weight of memory. I didn't know what to expect. Would she cry, apologize, turn away? But when I stopped just a few feet in front of her, she whispered, Harriet. It was the first time I'd heard her say my name since the day she left. My knees trembled, but I didn't fall. I thought about you every day, she said, voice cracking. I just didn't think you'd ever want to see me again. I could have told her the truth, how angry I'd been, how abandoned I had felt, how many nights I wept into my pillow, wondering why I wasn't enough for her to stay. But I didn't, because in her trembling hands and hollow voice, I saw someone who had survived something, too. You were right to leave, I said, but you should have taken me with you. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I know, she whispered, and I'm sorry. There were no dramatic embraces, no sudden healing in that moment, but there was something better, an understanding, a quiet truce between two women who had both been girls once, trying to survive the same fire in different ways. I visited her from time to time after that. We didn't rebuild everything we didn't need to. What we found instead was a kind of peace. And in peace, I discovered something I never expected. Forgiveness. Today. I'm 76 years old. My hair is gray. My hands are wrinkled. But my heart, it's strong. I live in a little house not far from where Sarah first took me in. I never married. Never had children of my own. But over the years, I became a foster parent, just like Sarah. I opened my door to girls who had that same hollow look I once wore like a second skin. Girls who needed someone to say, "You're safe now. You're wanted. You matter." And every time one of them curled up on my porch with a mug of hot cocoa and asked, "Why did you take me in?" I told them the truth. Because someone once did the same for me, and it changed everything. If you've lived through pain, real pain, the kind that stains your bones and whispers you're not worth saving, I want you to know something. You are not what happened to you. You are not the silence. You are not the bruises. You are not the ones who walked away. You are the one who stayed, the one who survived, the one who, despite everything, still hopes. Healing is not perfect. It takes time. It takes tears. But I promise you, there is light at the end of even the darkest road, and you are worthy of that light. If my story touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's build a space where survivors feel seen, where strength is honored and hope is never forgotten. And if you'd like to hear more stories like mine, stories of resilience, truth, and healing, please subscribe to channel, because every voice matters, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones. Thank you for listening, and may you always remember the pain may shape us, but it does not define us.